Welcome. We appreciate you joining with us to watch this message. We pray it will bless you, that we'll all learn, grow, and become more like Jesus. Let's join in watching the message at this time.
I did an internet search this past week and I came up with some interesting facts. First of all, I searched for the world's stingiest person. And after a couple different searches, the answer came up the same both times, or all different times. John Paul Getty. Now, if you're old enough, you probably know him as J. Paul Getty. He is famous for his wealth, but at the same time, he's famous for being known as the world's stingiest person. Born in 1892, died in 1976. He began accumulating his wealth in his 20s by drilling for oil, and he became known as the founder of the Getty Oil Company. The 1966 Guinness Book of Records holds him as the world's richest man at $1.2 billion. Remember, that's in 1966. But Getty's wealth did not earn him the kind of fame that most of us would like to have because, like I said, known as the world's stingiest man. He was a miser in many ways, but a couple examples of that. In 1973, one of his grandsons was kidnapped and held for a ransom of $22 million. Getty wouldn't have anything to do with it. We can understand that. You're not going to just pay a ransom right away. He was stubborn until the kidnappers sent a lock of his grandson's hair and one of his ears. At that point, the family of Getty got pretty anxious that he needs to negotiate. So he did himself, not through police, not through anybody else. He did all the negotiating himself, and he settled for $2.2 million. Why that number? That was the highest tax-deductible amount that he could take off his taxes that year, provided by law. Give you another example of how he was a skinflint. He was married 5 times and divorced 5 times. His 5th wife and him had a son. At 6 years old, he was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and he went blind. And of course, his mom was spending a lot of money on him. The dad, J. Paul Getty, complained that they were spending too much money on the boy. The boy died. J. Paul Getty did not attend his son's funeral. As a result, his wife divorced him that same year. Amazing. I don't think any of us blame her. Now, in contrast to that, I did a search for the most generous person in the world and came up with a list of the 20 most generous people in the world, which was interesting. Many of them we know. Michael Dell of Dell Computers, Ted Turner of Turner Broadcasting and Time Warner, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, Paul Allen, co-founder of Microsoft, Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York City, George Soros, liberal funding magnate of the Democrat Party, Warren Buffett, Wall Street tycoon, and Bill Gates, former head of Microsoft. Some very familiar names. We'll come back to them. Just hold them in thought. So today we conclude with our sermon series of the When Love Came Down, which we're talking about when God sent his son down to earth and in the form of love, in the form of a baby. Now, in this series, we've learned about the prophecies of the Old Testament leading up to the birth of Christ. And then we also looked at the prophecies, some of them as far as the second coming of Christ. And in that, Old Testament people had hope. We also have hope in Christ's second coming. We learned of Jesus' birth, that he brought joy to the world, thus very appropriate song we have. We learned that Christmas is not about our traditions. As many times in our traditions we get so carried away with them that we forget about Christ as the center of Christmas. But Christ is the center. And then last week we learned how God expressed his love for us when Christ was born. And he did it through so many different people and ways of working with people. It was amazing. And so today we're looking at the Magi and their Christmas generosity. We're not certain of the sequence of what happened after Jesus was born. In the book of Luke, we have the story that after Jesus was born, at 8 days he was circumcised according to the law. And then at 40 days, Mary went through the purification rites at the temple. So we know that's within a couple months. At the same time, in Matthew's gospel, we have the traditional story of the Magi visiting Jesus. And so, keeping with the traditional Christmas story, we're going to go with the Magi this morning. So let's begin reading Matthew chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the house where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I guess the first question that comes is, when did the Magi visit Jesus? It's very unlikely that it was on the same night as our tradition shows. When we see the nativity scene, we've got Mary and Joseph, Jesus in the manger, the shepherds, and the Magi with their camels, which is highly unlikely. It's doubtful that they arrived on that same night. Matter of fact, it says when they came to the house, which we assume that the next morning after Mary had given birth to Jesus, that they would have taken him from that scene and into the house or into an inn. We also know that the Magi stopped to talk with King Herod, which would not have been that night. They said the king that has been born. So Jesus was born at that time, so they would have talked to King Herod during the day, and so we know that some time had lapsed. So not to wreck our nativity scenes, that's fine, but just to put it in perspective. So what do we know about the Magi? So this is what we're after this morning. What do we know about the Magi, and what do we know about King Herod? The Magi came from the east, and from reading the story, we can assume some things. They were educated men. They were astronomers. They studied the stars. They were wealthy. They were Gentiles. In the fact that they came looking for the king of the Jews. They didn't say our king. They were looking for the king of the Jews, which would have separated them from being Jews. They followed the star as far as Bethlehem, or as far as Jerusalem, where they would have naturally stopped. And Jerusalem is where the temple was at, the place of the Jewish worship. It's where the king of the land resided. So it would make sense for them to stop in Jerusalem and ask things about this newborn king. Let's read verse 3 again. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Why was King Herod disturbed, and why was all of Jerusalem disturbed with him? Well, we're going to learn more about King Herod pretty soon, but he was a tyrant. And when King Herod was upset, everyone was upset. We could talk about King Herod all morning, because there's a lot that we know about him, and basically none of it is any good. Along with other atrocities that King Herod committed, for example, He killed one of his wives. He killed her brother, his brother-in-law. And he killed 2 of King Herod's and that wife's sons, all because he thought they were somehow conspiring to take over his kingship. So if King Herod suspected anyone, or you at the time, of taking over his kingship, you were going to get executed. And everyone that he assumed that of, whether they were guilty of it or not, got executed. So you get the idea. When King Herod was disturbed, everybody in Jerusalem was disturbed. Take, for example, I think we've all been around our parents when they were upset or angry. And we all knew, stay away from Dad and Mom. So just think if you were the king that was known for killing people. If the king is upset, stay away from the king. And everybody is upset because we don't know what he's going to do. And the Magi unknowingly set off this tirade of King Herod. Unintentional, but they still did it. King Herod told the Magi, he said, well, let me know where he's at so I can go worship him too. But we know from what we're going to read pretty soon, his intention was to kill baby Jesus. So the Magi then continued following the star. Let's read verse 11 one more time. On coming to the house, now this is talking about the Magi, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So once again, when the star stopped over the house, Jesus is no longer in the stable or in the manger scene. But notice the first thing the Magi did. Now remember, they were not Jews. But the first thing they did was to bow down to the baby, to the infant, which is impactful for them as Gentiles. They worshiped the king, then they opened their treasures, presented him with the gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Their treasures revealed a lot about the Magi, the wealth and some other things that we've talked about. But it also defines that their wealth did not define their hearts. Their hearts defined what they did with their wealth. Therefore, the point is then that the Magi's gifts were not about wealth. The Magi had generous hearts. The Magi had generous hearts. Remember the list that we talked about of the rich people and how they were giving away some of their money? I don't know if you've heard of the man. I've never heard of him. Charles Francis Feeney. He is the poorest billionaire you will ever hear of. Currently, he's 90 years old and has a value of $1.5 million. Now, listen between the millions and the billions. Currently has $1.5 million at the age of 90. But over his lifetime, he has given away over $8 billion because he concluded he didn't need it. How much wealth do you actually need? And he gave most all of his wealth away. Matter of fact, at one point in part of his business ventures, he set up part of his business to give away his money, and within giving away most all of it, he dissolved that aspect of his business. The guy's got a big heart. Now, I don't know what all he gave it to. I do know that he gave $1 billion to Cornell University. So I don't know what he did with the rest, but to give it away takes a pretty generous heart. I learned that he is a penny pincher, maybe like J. Paul Getty, but where J. Paul Getty was pinching for himself, Feeney pinched to give it away. Vast difference. Now, remember those names that I mentioned, those famous people and how they were so wealthy, but yet they'd given some away. That list includes a generosity scale, and I have no clue how they figure this out, how it works, but they rate it on a percentage on the generosity of these rich billionaires. For example, Mark Zuckerberg rates a 4% on the generosity scale, which would mean, as rich as he is, he's given very little of his money away. Michael Dell rates a little better at 6%. Michael Bloomberg rates 8%. Now, of the people that we recognize their names, now we have a big jump. George Soros rates 33%. Warren Buffett rates 35%. And the richest person on the list has given away more money than anybody else, which is Bill Gates. He rates at 32%. So the question is, where does Charles Feeney rate? Well, Charles Feeney rates 420,000% on the generosity scale because he gave so much of it away. What a heart. Now, we don't know where the Magi would rate on this. Probably very, very low compared to Feeney. But we do know that they were generous because of the gifts that they gave. Gold was of ultimate value, fit for a king. Frankincense is an expensive perfume burned for worship and burned for important social occasions. Myrrh is a luxurious cosmetic fragrance. So very, very expensive. Now, it's been said that gold is for royalty, frankincense is for Christ's divinity, and myrrh is for burial. Don't know if that's true or not, but somebody came up with it. It makes sense. But the important thing is the generosity of these men that traveled to worship the king. They had generous hearts. Not so with King Herod. Let's continue with verse 12. Now, this is talking about the Magi. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where they stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Now remember what we said about Herod. He's a tyrant. So much so that in order to make certain that he got baby Jesus killed, or this toddler, he most likely went above the age necessary. So this is why it was probably sometime around that 1 year or less. But he would have definitely made sure that he got everybody killed. And so just can't fathom what he had done. So our point is, King Herod's kingship was not about wealth. He had a self-serving heart. Not about wealth, it's about self-serving. King Herod was only about himself. And if you know anything about Israel's history, you know that King Herod built a lot of magnificent structures. First of all, knowing that it was Herod's temple. In other words, we have in the Old Testament, we have Solomon's temple was the first one, which was ultra magnificent, gold everywhere. Then we have the temple that was built after the destruction of the first temple when Israel came back to their land, which was, by the standards, pretty shoddy. And then we have Herod's temple, which when Rome took over and Herod came into power, he built this magnificent temple for the Jews. Now, here again, it was all about King Herod. So he would do this to appease the religious leaders. And if you know about Jesus' ministry and the trouble that he had with the religious leaders of Israel, they were a lot of times under the control of the king and so forth. So this was a ploy by Herod. We also know that he built the Masada fortress, which was on the western side of the Dead Sea. It was on top of a plateau. If you know anything about the Masada, look it up when you get home tonight or this afternoon, if you don't know anything about it, because it's some pretty interesting reading. Herod built the Masada for a refuge just in case there was a rebellion against Rome, or in case against him, he could go to this fortress and stay there, and it was almost impenetrable. That's why I say look it up and read on it, because it's pretty interesting reading. He built Herodium, which was a fortress, a palace that he built near Bethlehem, which had towers, a bathhouse, mosaic floors, magnificent living quarters. He built Caesarea Maritima, which is on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. He also built 3 temples to Caesar, one in Caesarea Philippi and then 2 other ones. These were magnificent structures, unbelievable. But he did it on the taxpayers' back, which was on the Israelite people. So think about this. Rome, Caesar demanded a tax. He wanted his money. Herod wanted his money for himself and to build these structures. And then, of course, you've got the Israelite tax collectors that everyone hated because they wanted their cut. So you've got all of these people wanting their money, so you can imagine the taxation was really heavy. From knowing about the Magi, what we can learn from knowing about King Herod, we can see the contrast. Distinct, sharp contrast between the Magi and Herod. The Magi were kind. Herod was extremely greedy. The Magi were generosity-oriented. King Herod was self-oriented. The Magi brought peace. King Herod brought fear. The Magi came in love. King Herod ruled in hatred. The Magi brought joy. King Herod brought sorrow and suffering. The Magi brought kindness. King Herod brought inhumanity. The Magi brought and came in gentleness. King Herod brought and came in cruelty and severity. I think we get the idea. They were extreme opposites of each other. People wanted near the Magi. People wanted away from King Herod. We don't know a whole lot, at least about Charles Feeney, but what we do know is he was very, very generous. And we don't know much about the Magi, but we see their generosity. We know about King Herod more, and we know how he was so self-oriented. If you had to compare somebody, compare King Herod to somebody that we can associate with, think of Scrooge in Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. Only in the Christmas Carol, Scrooge turned from the bad guy to a good guy. King Herod never did turn good. Matter of fact, Herod was so afraid that nobody would mourn his death. According to Josephus, the historian, King Herod ordered that upon his death, important people were to be brought from Jericho to Jerusalem and execute them, so there would be mourning upon King Herod's death. Not for him, of course, but for others. Fortunately, King Herod's son and daughter refused to carry that order out, and so no one was executed. And it's doubtful that anyone mourned for King Herod. Now here's the question that we need to answer. Who are we most like? Now hopefully nobody here's like a King Herod. But aren't we kind of like both at times? That sometimes we're very, very generous and sometimes we're self-centered. So here's our point. Generous love is the most precious gift, benefiting both the giver and the recipient. I mean, we can see this in God giving his son. It benefited him and it benefits us. Generous love is the most precious gift. Just think about Herod. Did his greed prosper him? I mean, think about living like Herod. You're always looking over your shoulder. You're always suspecting somebody. Was he really happy? It's very, very doubtful. But the Magi, they gave gifts to the young family, and who benefited? Both the Magi in their generosity and Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. And we've been there. We've been generous with people. I mean, think of Christmas. You've just exchanged gifts. How wonderful it is, the feeling that you get when you've given a gift to somebody that maybe was something more than you could afford, but you really want to do it, and they really appreciated it. You got that warm feeling too. So how about you and me? How do we treat people? where would we rate on this generosity scale? And I'm not talking money. Where would we rate? How generous are we? In your bulletin, on the back of your bulletin, bottom of your notes, there's a quote. And it's a real impactful quote. People do not remember what you say. They remember how you make them feel. Now, if you don't have a bulletin, pick one up on the way out, because we need to remember this. I fail at this a lot of times. I get more concerned about what I want or what should be, and I get less concerned about how I say it and what other people's feelings are. People don't remember what you say. They remember how you make them feel. So how do you feel about King Herod? I mean, when you learn that he not only killed anybody that got in his way, he even killed babies. Not only in Bethlehem, but even in the vicinity around, just to make sure he got them all. We don't have a good feeling about Herod. But what feeling do we have about the Magi? We have warm feelings for them. We have warm feelings for the entire Christmas story, except for King Herod. So, are you and I generous, or are we self-centered? It's the time of the year where we consider ourselves generous, but you know what? We get tired. We get grumpy. We want things our way. And so sometimes we can slip also. And remember, generosity does not depend upon our wealth. You don't need wealth to give a meaningful gift. Not all gifts cost a vast amount of money. Peace costs nothing. But how easy it is to give peace to someone's life that's in turbulence. Just to be with them. Just to help them to calm. Encouragement costs us nothing, but think how priceless it is to someone that's hurting emotionally. And sitting with someone costs nothing. But to a lonely person, it's everything. In 1910, a young Norman Vincent Peale was 12 years old. Now, Norman Vincent Peale was a minister in some of the New York City area churches. He was in one church for 50 years. In 1910, he was 12 years old. He graduated, by the way, from Bellefontaine High School, and then lived part of his youth in Cincinnati. One Christmas Eve, his dad and him were walking home from shopping. Christmas the next day. It was getting late. Young Norman was tired. He was getting grumpy. And as they were walking along, as Norman Vincent Peale tells, a beggar came up and with claw-like fingers touched his arm, asking for money. Young Norman flinched away from him in anger and in an attitude like, "Don't touch me, you're worthless." His dad gave young Norman a little bit of a lecture. You don't treat people like that. And remember, it's Christmas Eve. Where's your heart? Norman didn't care. He said, "But Dad, he's a tramp. He's dirty. He's filthy." His dad wouldn't have it. He said, "Norman, you don't treat people like that. You don't know his circumstances. Did he fall in hard times? Or did he make a decision? It didn't matter. Treat him humanely." And with that, his dad reached into his pocket and pulled out $1. Now remember, in 1910, $1 was a lot of money. He handed it to Norman and he says, "Go give this to that man, telling him that you're giving it to him in the name of Christmas." Norman wasn't about to do it. And his dad got very authoritative, dad-like. He says, "Norman, go give the man this $1 in the name of Christmas." So begrudgingly, Norman ran, caught up with the man, got his attention, handed him the $1 bill, and says, "I'm giving this to you in the name of Christmas." As Norman Vincent Peale tells the story, the man was transformed. The dirty beggar got a grin that went ear to ear. Norman says, "I was overcome with just the generosity that we'd just done to the man." He said, "All at once, I didn't see the beggar. I didn't see his dirt. I didn't see that he was unshaved. I saw a human being that needed help. and was gracious, was thankful for that help. Dormer said, like, I didn't even think about the neighborhood that we were in anymore. I didn't see the houses. All I saw was this man's face that he was thankful. Generosity. Generosity will do that. It blesses both us and the recipient. The question is, for us today, who will we be generous to? And my guess is we need to start with those that are nearest to us, our spouses, our kids, our family, our parents. Because the people that we're most comfortable with are often the people that we are less generous to a lot of times. We snap them off. We treat them poorly. We just don't treat them as we should. And then, once we've been generous to those around us, let's keep branching out. Not only in this Christmas season, but the coming year. After all, God's gift to us in His Son was the most generous gift we could ever receive. Almighty Father in heaven, it's the Christmas season. And yes, at this time of the year, we think about the Christmas story and our hearts are warmed and we are more generous typically than what we are the rest of the year. But Father, help us not to stop at that point. Transform us, Father. Help us to remember what you've done for us despite what we've put back on you, that we cost Jesus his life. He didn't come to be born. He came to live and die and to be raised again for us. So, Father, speak to our hearts the generosity that we need to give to others. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you for watching the message. If we can help you in any way, we ask that you please contact us. Check us out on our website at roscopchurch.org. You can find the information there, how to contact us. We'd love to hear from you, talk with you, and help you in your walk with Jesus. Thank you once again for joining with us.